Hello, fellow educators. My name is Jeff Koslowski. I am a secondary education history teacher at Henry Ford Academy in Dearborn, Michigan.
And hi, I'm Heather Sobek. I am an 8th grade U.S. history teacher in Coldwater, Michigan.
And we are here to present our webinar about how to get kids into the education field. And for our presentation, we went with the title of Stuff, Ordinary Objects, Extraordinary Stories. And as we came up with this, we were trying to think of ways that we could get kids really introduced into the field of history as more than just things to remember, but that we are all making history in some way, shape, or form. And so that's where this kind of came to be. How can we get kids at a lower level, a lower grade level, how can we get them interested and invested and show that there's a lot that goes into the field of history? So what we have, what you'll find in the link are all of our standards, benchmarks, and stuff. We are linked through the Michigan Social Studies Content Standard, since we're both Michigan teachers. We also have our C3 indicators, disciplinary literacy essential practices here, ISTE standards, digital literacy. But again, all of it is included, but really it's the idea of, as we've kind of mentioned here, trying to hook the students at the beginning and how to get them to see that history, how it is actually put together. So we're looking at a compelling question, our compelling question of how can ordinary stuff make history? Not every museum and not every classroom is going to have the first this or the most important that. Sometimes they have a pretty basic, pretty run-of-the-mill, everyday object. But that object can be something that really tells a major, important story. And we want the kids to see that it's these everyday objects that can really give you a good glimpse about how people live, work, and play. So we're targeting roughly our sixth grade students when social studies goes from being one element of many in elementary school to one focalized class. So we have our section divided into multiple units here. We're going to start with lesson 1, how to be a historian, looking at how do historians work with historical objects. And actually, let me talk about the compelling question here about how can ordinary stuff make history. We're going to be looking at these elements here of how historians work with historical objects. What can these everyday objects tell us about historical events? How do museums use them to tell history? And what do your everyday objects say about your life? We really want to make the connection that your students are making history every single day. And whether they realize it or not, that history is important to them and to others. So starting with lesson 1 here, how to be a historian. We're looking at how do historians work with historical objects. We've put together a Google slide presentation that connects in some of the major elements here. Now, because we're targeting younger students, we feel it is important to give an introduction to primary and secondary sourcing. And so with our slides here, we give the definition about what a primary source and secondary source is from the Library of Congress. And then we encourage students as a group to think about what those sources might be and the differences between them. Then we investigate the idea of trustworthiness. And can you trust particular sources to be telling the right thing? Going back to those slides, we can now look at things cited from the New Jersey Institute of Technology about what facts have been omitted, additional information is necessary, what words create positive or negative impressions, and what impression would I have if different words were used. And so this is having students be able to identify what is a primary source, what is a secondary source, and is the creator of that source trying to get at something special or something maybe infamous. Take, for example, this news headline As you can see, 2 whites dead in race riot from the Tulsa Daily World. This obviously, and you look at the dating here, is in reference to the Tulsa race massacres, but noticing how the sourcing and the influence makes a difference here, and that this isn't a story of numerous African Americans being killed. 2 whites dead is the main headline here. So it shows you that there is a bias here. At the same time, perhaps one of the more famous primary sources, this engraving from Paul Revere discussing the Boston Massacre, numerous factual inaccuracies here, and numerous things that are trying to be influenced to get more people involved. Everything from Butcher's Hall by the British to the fact that this is a very orderly firing, which has been disproven. So we get our kids to look at sourcing and be able to start making identifications from that. Now, as we spent our time talking about different museums, one of our sources, the Holocaust Memorial Center in Farmington, Michigan, talked about the idea of objects within, specifically passive, active, witnessing, and representative objects. And we have the definition here on these same slides about what these objects can mean. An active object being an object that played a specific role and the event doesn't happen without it. A passive object is involved but not necessarily critical. A witnessing object, something that's involved in an event in proximity, not involved in the event, but it is in the proximity when it took place. So think of something in the room when an event took place. And then a representative object, which is not involved in any way, but is needed to tell the story. Each of these slides has questions at the end to have the students discuss for a few minutes, just to make sure that they are getting it and you're not talking at them for too long. Now, on to lesson 2, we wanted to connect it to an important historical event, and that historical event being the Underground Railroad. Both of us being from Michigan, we wanted to talk about the Underground Railroad, as it is, an important detail for us, but it also looks a lot about sourcing here. Now, we've included a graphic organizer to be able to connect down here. So we have a graphic organizer to look at sources and how these sources, are they primary, secondary, is it trustworthy, and is it active, passive, witnessing, or representative? And so you have things from buildings to flyers to quilts, which is a major story there, contentious among historians, but nevertheless still an interesting one here. We have sources and information. It is all linked, at which point we skip down to our formative assessment, which is asking what else do historians need to help tell the story of the Underground Railroad, and what sources might be missing. And again, all of this is linked down to the bottom as we keep scrolling here. So once we have we've made our way through lesson 2, Heather's going to take over and take us into lesson number 3.
So one of the great things about this project that we've been involved with is that we've been able to see museums all over the state of Michigan. And one maybe silver lining of the pandemic is how many museums have opened their doors in a digital way to students. And so for our next lesson, we really wanted to get the kids considering, how does a museum tell history? What kinds of things are included in museums and what are not included in museums, by looking at some different virtual exhibits. So we have here some links to maybe a classroom exploration of one specific exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and then giving the kids then some choice in step 3 to look at a museum exhibit on their own with some different topics kind of around the country and world, that they could choose what made sense to them. But then really thinking about, what is the museum doing when they make the choices that they make? Why does a museum choose to display a certain object and not another object? Why does a museum choose to, have placards on the wall, that kind of thing. And so we're having them fill in a graphic organizer, which again, it's linked and it's down below, to help them kind of process and think through that, because eventually when we get to our summative task, they're going to be thinking about a museum of their own life. Then we want to make sure that they're already kind of starting to think about what are some of the things in their life that might fit into a museum telling a certain story. And so this lesson is really all about them thinking, how can a museum tell a story? So then when we get to lesson 4, the Museum of You, which is really getting us into our summative assessment. I think our summative assessment could even be right here in lesson 4. What do your everyday objects say about your life? And so this is our show and tell portion, where we're asking the students to bring in 2 or 3 objects that are related to the same story of something that happened to themselves, or a family story, and to bring those objects into class, or if that's not possible, to bring photos of the object into class, and then to look at those objects as a historian, talk about the same things that they did, back in lesson 2. What kinds of sources are these? Are these sources trustworthy? What kinds of objects are they? And then to have them start writing museum placards for their own objects to try to give some of the history, and we give them some examples of what that looks like. And then to have them kind of switch with a classmate and see if they can tell the story of a classmate's, family history or whatever based on the objects and the museum placards. And then if not, to have that be a place where they can go in and maybe do some editing before we then got to our summative assessment, which is to create a digital museum exhibit of their own family history story or their own personal history story. And so we said that students can choose how to best represent their exhibit, maybe a slideshow or a website or some other form that they might know about. And then they can place those museum placards and photos of the object into that virtual space in order to be able to then share with their classmates. And I really like this because I think that it does a really good job of bringing kids into the history, but also if you're doing this at the beginning of the year, making that classroom community connection. So, and then we have our rubric there. Everybody loves a rubric.
And so as Heather mentioned, all of our sourcing is listed below here, all of our examples and things that you could have the kids do. Everything that was linked on the above is located down below. This is as Heather mentioned, this is a really great idea for building a good classroom community, for kids to be able to see things about each other that maybe didn't seem like that big a deal to them, but now when others look at it, perhaps they can find ways to make connections here. And as we've included an example about a baseball and a story about the first home run, you can in turn say, well, hey, I play baseball too. So we thought this was we think this is a wonderful example, from top to bottom, about ways to get kids introduced into the subject of history and think about what you're able to do, how historians and museum professionals are able to do it from start to finish. So we thank you for your time. We thank you for everything that you have you've given us. We thank everybody from Library of Congress and the Digitally Writing Histories collection here from September all the way until now. We've learned a lot, and it's really truly appreciated. So thank you for watching. We hope you're able to take some things away from this, and we wish you and your students a pleasant summer and a great rest of your school year.